Welcome to the Managing People podcast, a place for people with curious minds. Can I ask you something? Have you ever had a bad manager? If you have, you'll know the impact they can have on your life far beyond the workplace. But if you've been lucky enough to have a good manager, you'll know they can be nothing short of life-changing. That's what this podcast is all about, helping managers become great ones. With real stories and practical tips from people who've faced the challenges, learned from their mistakes, and enjoyed success as leaders. For even more insights and ideas, you can check out the People Managing Hub. And if you're serious about upskilling managers and measuring the results, visit the Managing People page at upskillpeople.com. You'll find something remarkable waiting for you there. My guest today is no stranger to tackling challenges head on. Her curiosity, determination, and exceptional people skills have driven her to achieve incredible things, including becoming the first British woman to ski to the North Pole. So, Sue Stockdale, welcome to the Managing People podcast. It's great to have you along.
Thanks, Pete. It's lovely to speak to you today.
So, let's begin as we always do at the beginning. When do you first think in your history, school, work, that you actually started to get some insights into the powerful thing about relationships and coordinating people?
I would say being in the Brownies. Back as a youngster, 8, 9, 10 years old, I was part of the Brownie Guides, and in that group, I was in a group of peers, other girls along with me, and it was about learning there to sometimes take the lead in an activity or to see that others how they would take the lead and behave towards one another. I think what really I reflect on now is that was core to the Brownies, for me being something I really enjoyed, is it was connecting to a bigger mission, something bigger than just myself. And I think today that's even more important in the world of business, that we are able to do that as leaders and managers. So Brownies, yeah, that's probably where I connect to a group of people and leadership and managing and engaging with others.
And there was a purpose, which I guess is what you're saying in terms of business.
Yeah, exactly.
So then after Brownies, school, anything that you started to learn there then?
Well, I did have a period of time in school where I seemed to manage to go through my exams and do well without having to try too hard. And all the girls who were the in crowd stopped speaking to me for a while. And it would have been, I suppose, quite easy to then take one's foot off the gas and maybe not try as hard and want to fit into there. But I chose to see that I didn't really just want to be like them, because I guess I became comfortable with sometimes being the outsider and the observer. And actually, again, thinking back to management and leadership, Pete, that is a skill I think a leader needs to also have, is you don't always have to be liked, but you need to be respected. And that sometimes being that outsider and not fitting in brings value, but you've got to be prepared to be uncomfortable in that space for a period of time.
And I know for certain that you recognise the importance of putting all the hard work in. And you know, I think there's a famous quote that said it takes 20 years to become an overnight success. When you discovered running, was that the first point when you recognised that? Yes,
I think it was. At our school, my PE teacher, our physical education teacher, was Margot Wells, and her husband was Alan Wells, who won the Olympic gold medal in the 100 metres in Moscow in 1980. And he brought his medal to school and came and gave us a talk. And first of all, there was that power of inspiration to see somebody who's achieved excellence is very inspiring and made me want to compete in athletics. And then Margot, she saw I had a talent in running, and so she encouraged me to join the local running club. And from there, I just continued to challenge myself. And when I did a 3-mile race and managed that okay, then I would think, well, maybe I can do a 10-mile race, and I managed that. And then maybe I can do a half marathon. And so always that continual improvement, continually not just sitting on one's laurels and thinking this is good enough, has really what's pushed me to perhaps achieve things that I never imagined I could do. And again, I think continuous improvement, that philosophy, is something that's even more important in work today as well.
So, moving on from school and all those various other activities, we have 2 job offers that you got.
Yeah, it's funny. This is 1982, and I think that there was a high level of unemployment at that time. So it was quite surprising to get offered a job in the bank, and that was going to be following in the footsteps of my sister who worked there, and a job in an energy company. And the energy company also offered day release, so you could have one day off work a week and go to college and to continue to study and learn. And they were offering a slightly higher salary as well. So there were 2 things that swayed my decision. One was I probably didn't want to follow in the footsteps of my sister and just carve my own path, but also that desire to continue learning and growing. And although I had done very well in my exams, there was no track record in our household of going to university or continuing academic studies. So I wanted to get into the world of work, earn money. And I thought, well, what better that I can earn money, work, and continue to learn. And then, of course, after that, I did go on and do a master's degree and an MBA. So I've never lost the love of learning. I just think sometimes the way that the academic structure is set up is we don't always have to follow tradition or what might be expected of us. And we will each come to learning at a different time.
And the world of work was very different then. Describe what it was like at the energy company.
Well, we didn't have email then, Pete. We used to speak to one another, which which is becoming a thing of the past these days. And also, I started as a junior clerical assistant. It was almost like a really low-level graduate scheme. I spent 3 months in different departments, moving around the finance function, and that's where it really opened up my eyes to the world of managers who were effective and managers who were less effective. And there was one manager who saw me as probably the bright young thing coming in wanting to learn. And she just really accelerated that enthusiasm that I had. She empowered me to try new things or to go one stage further. She would give me an activity and I'd come back and say, and I've finished that and I've also tried this too. And she'd say, fantastic, brilliant. And that gave me encouragement. And then there was the other manager who I think was really resistant to change. And I remember in one activity that I was doing, a fairly mundane, boring activity, and I said to her, why are we doing it like this? Because I'm sure we could do it in this different way that would be far more efficient. She said, Sue, you're not paid to think, just get on and do it that way. And all of that enthusiasm that I had was kind of quashed. And I realised I didn't want to work with people that were of her ilk in terms of managing, and I wanted more of that empowerment and encouragement. But what it did give me in this organisation was really a potential. I could see potential of growth and developing my career. And as I moved through the organisation, I became one of the youngest senior managers at the time in the activity that I was doing, which was continual improvement. It was total quality management, as we called it then. But even the environment was different. I talked about, we didn't have email. There was differentiation in terms of management and let's call it the workers. And the senior managers, they worked on a sort of mezzanine level in the office. And there was plush carpet in their location. And they had private toilets. And so I sometimes would have to go up there to deliver a message to one of the secretaries or take a document. And it was like going into this rarefied atmosphere. And even that environment, was off-putting. It sent a message. But it also made me think, why do these people have to operate in this different way to us? They had lovely views out over the River Forth in Scotland. And there was me. It didn't necessarily make me want to get to that level, but I just noticed the difference. And then there was one other funny thing that happened then, Pete, is because I was running and training and competing competitively, I used to run at lunchtime, as did a number of the other employees in the company. Now, when we were running together, and I most of the time I was the only woman, and it was mostly other men that I was running with, we were just people. We run along the promenade and, do these 5 or 6 mile lunchtime runs. And it wasn't until later that I realised that some of these people that I was running with were senior managers, were in positions of responsibility. But I didn't think about them in terms of their job title and that positional power that they had. I thought of them as a human being, and I could engage with them and have a conversation, and we'd run along together and chat. And somehow I think that also is an important learning for me in the journey of management and leadership. Sometimes people see people with positional power, with seniority, they're fearful of the job title. They think this person must be some sort of superhero. And yes, respect should be afforded to people who are in seniority. And I also think we need to see them as human beings and see them as a equal to in terms of human being, so that we can engage in that type of conversation. The minute we put somebody on a pedestal and we discount our own knowledge and capability, then it's a different type of conversation. So I always try and think these days, and I encourage those that I coach to think about people that they're engaging with as on a level, and how do you engage with that person as a human being and not engaging with their job title. So those are some of the things that I learned from my world of work in the early 80s.
Very sage advice. And I know you used to have a little bit of fun watching your manager squirm when you went into the girls at the data input centre. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, one of my jobs, and this was in the accounting function, was to take some information into the data centre, as you say, where it was the team, all of us working there happened to be women. And sometimes I was going in with a last minute request and they would have to take some action for us. Well, I realised, again, the power of relationships. So I got to know these people, although it was quite scary at first because they seemed a little bit cliquey and they always seemed to be laughing and joking. And I was quite nervous at first, but then I got into to speaking to them and always going in with a smile and so on. So I could go in and get things done. And, through relationship, through engaging with people and perhaps the way I asked. And then those that were more senior to me, one day I remember one of them wanted to go and take action. So they strode down, this happened to be a male, strode down into the thing and kind of used his positional power to try and make something happen. Well, effectively, the girls just laughed at him. And of course, he couldn't make things happen. And and again, ironically, their boss, the girls in that department, as they used to be called, the girls in that department where their leader was one of those people that I ran with at lunchtime. So I had this different dynamic of relationships with people in the company because I saw them as people out with their positional power. So again, just that way to get to know somebody, understand what's important for them and see it as a kind of negotiation. How can we make this a win-win rather than just going in and telling somebody what to do? Most of the time these days, I don't think that works very effectively because people have a choice as to whether they're working or not and how they use their time. So the whole world of work is completely different now, I think.
I know in your wonderful book, John David Bartow, who did the foreword, he described you as curious, and this curiosity led you to a wonderful training centre, I believe they had in the energy company. What did that take? What turn did that take in your career?
Yeah, well, there I was in this big office, and not in the area of the plush carpets, but across the road from our main building was the training centre for the company. And it was in this old manor house, and they had beautiful gardens, and it was a very beautiful place to go. It had a completely different ambience. They even had a free coffee machine, and in those days that was a big deal. And so I set my mind to say I'd love to work there. I'd love to go and work in that department. I was curious to find out what happened there. So I used to go on lots of training courses. And then, as luck would have it, I was able to go on an expedition, a charity expedition that the company sponsored me to go on for 3 months. I went to Kenya back in 1988. And having had an amazing experience there, come back to the world of work, I said, I don't want to work in this finance function anymore. I really realise it's not where my strengths lie. I think my strengths lie over in that training department. And so I asked my the training manager, if you like, how can I get to work there? And as it happened, then a job came up that I was able to go and participate in. But the one thing in those days, and this was in the introduction of technology into the world of business, so my job was IT trainer. And I must admit at the start, that didn't really appeal to me. I thought, I want to be working with people. This IT stuff doesn't seem so interesting. But unbeknown to me, I was at the forefront of that pioneering change. So I was training people in what we would know today as, Excel and Microsoft Word and the early days of email, and working and training those people from the land of the plush carpets right down to the people at the front customer facing end of the organisation, training those people in how to use technology. And if you ever sat behind a computer and had to learn a new program, I'm sure, Pete, you will know that you might press a key or you might do something and it doesn't work. And these days, I'm sure we're all much more savvy in terms of how to get ourselves out of problems if we've tried something in technology and it doesn't seem to go the way we're expecting. But imagine running a training course where you've got 10 people there and they're all sitting at their computer, all trying and experimenting with things, and you're trying to have to sort of facilitate that. I mean, that was a great lesson for me in managing uncertainty and trying to follow people's interests without being like that manager and saying, don't do that, you can't do that. So it took me into this, unbeknown to me, into this great world. And pretty soon I moved on from the IT training to doing management development, leadership development, and working with human beings rather than just with the technology and human beings. So for me, curiosity, and many of the steps I've taken in my career have always been driven by curiosity. I wonder what it'd be like to work there. I wonder what that company would be like. I wonder, that person seems interesting. I want to go and discover more about them. And so curiosity is probably the biggest thing that takes me forward.
And I'm sure we'll come back to the training side, but that curiosity, Sue, that led you to Croatia. Tell me about that.
Well, as I've alluded to, I had done this expedition, had an amazing life experience, and realised that sitting in an office all the time didn't satisfy my need for adventure and sort of the need for curiosity and learning. And so I saw an advert as I was going to work one day that was talking about a job working with the United Nations in the former Yugoslavia. And it was a quality management related job as well, which is what I was doing in the company, energy company at the time. And so I thought, imagine the chance to go and work in a war zone. What a great adventure that would be. Now, for many, they might think, oh, no way, I'd never want to do that. I think what also piqued my curiosity, Pete, is the media give us one angle on any conflict situation. They don't tell us the entire story. And so I wanted to get behind that almost and think, is what we see in the newspapers and read on and see on the television the reality? There are still human beings living there. What's it like? So I went off and I left my corporate career, my comfortable corporate career, onto this, what many people saw was a huge risk to take, to go off and work for a 1-year contract in a war zone. And on day one, given a flak jacket and a helmet as my onboarding was not what I had expected. But again, taking myself into a new environment, seeing how some of the skills that I was bringing could be useful in that environment, taking a risk and it paying off, only gave me more confidence to face uncertainty and the unknown again in the world after that.
And I was amazed at the amount of people that were there. Was it something like 3,000 people supporting 30,000 military folk?
Yes, there were 3,000 civilians supporting 30,000. So, it's an interesting environment to work in and to observe how that type of mission and activity operates. So, I think no matter what environment we're in, we can learn things.
And in that environment, it was a hierarchical organisation structure. And I would imagine from what you've said, you had to find the people with the true power as opposed to the seniority to get things done. And there's definite parallels with that in business. There's people with sort of incidental power that can really make things happen, even if they don't have the seniority. Is that something that you learned quite quickly there? Yes,
you can imagine that there's a very hierarchical structure in the military. And it's being, again, respectful and following that. One of the tasks I was given was to go and find out in a particular transport workshop why there seemed to be a high cost in that particular function compared to other transport workshops. And to make sure they were doing things the appropriate, using the appropriate procedure. So how I went about it, well, first of all, again, I'm going into an all-male environment as an only female. So I think sometimes that ability to build relationships and not be seen always as a threat or coming in with judgment, perhaps as somebody, another man might have come in and there might have been generally a bit of testosterone or a bit of competition. So I think that I can always see coming in, as a different gender, first of all, can sometimes be an advantage. So I began to just ask questions, sat down with them with a cup of coffee and said, well, what do you do here? Tell me about how you work. And they began to tell me all what they did. And then as I was quickly drawing as they were talking, and I was drawing a simple flow chart. And I said, so is this process what you do? Is this what you're telling me? They said, yes. I said, that's really helpful. Thank you. So that gave me they'd be able to spot the gap, to say, well, I knew what the proper procedure was, and now I had an idea of what their actual procedure was. And therefore it was about seeing there was some gaps and then working out how we would fill those gaps. But that came out of just meeting people where they're at, understanding their world, and not bringing judgment, but bringing curiosity to say, help me understand. And during that process, building trust. And it's the trust and the relationship that then means that when one might have to go back and say, well, actually, you need to change what you're doing here, or, that actually there's a different way. Did you realise that? How can we work towards that? That's going to be treated with a lot of more receptivity than just somebody coming in and saying, here's the process, follow that. Because that doesn't get buy-in from anybody. So those experiences, they all have shaped how I've looked at leadership and management going forward in my career.
Some things don't change, do they, Sue? So beyond that then, you obviously survived that, didn't have to use the flak jacket, hopefully too often. Where next then? What happened after that?
Well, after that, I continued. I came back to the UK and continued studying for my master's degree full time. So I thought I'd go back, and I'd started it while I was working overseas on a part-time basis, but I was able to come back and fast track that process. So while I was studying, I spotted an advert in the newspaper to join a team of novices to go on an expedition to the North Pole. And I just thought again, wow, here's a chance to have a great adventure. And I wonder what it would be like. I wonder what it would be like to survive in temperatures maybe cold enough to freeze your flesh in seconds, to a bit like going into your freezer. I wonder what it'd be like to spend a month doing that. And so, well, I just took the first step, sent off for information. And then when the brochure came back and it was all pictures of men, and on the front it said, are you man enough for the ultimate challenge? Well, that just was an additional motivation. I thought, these people just assume it's going to just be men on this expedition. Why can't I do it like anybody else? And so there were two qualifications that the expedition leader was looking for. The ability to work in a team. So I knew I could do that. And then the ability to raise £15,000, which was probably, I would have been able to buy a house for that amount of money back in those days almost. And I had no idea how to do that. But I said to myself, well, if it's meant to be, I'll find a way. Just give it a go. Just take the next step. And it's that, I think sometimes that willingness to step into uncertainty and know it might not work, but I would probably regret if I hadn't tried in the first place. And through a whole process of selection, I managed to get on that team, and I found myself going off on an expedition to the North Pole and becoming the first British woman to do so. Now, I had never imagined that that was ever possible. But having done that success, having achieved that success with my teammates, I realised that maybe something of my story, how I'd got to my North Pole, could be relevant for other managers and leaders and people that want to get to their equivalent North Pole in their career or their life. And that there were some lessons that I could share. And I thought that's going to have a bigger impact on the world than just photographs in an album and personal memories for me. I have to use this experience for the greater good. And that's really what compelled me into doing what I'm doing today, working with leaders, working with managers and organisations, helping them effectively to get to their North Pole.
And there were a couple of other things that you referenced that struck me. The first one, I think, was a Ray Mears quote when he was commenting on the power of belief that you can do something. I think, was it a couple had survived in the Arctic for a month and they were only supposed to last a week. And then the other one was, it was deciding what to leave behind, which helps you focus. And I thought there was a direct parallel with that. And I think it's Bill Gates and Warren Buffett are both attributed with saying, the real key to getting progress in strategy and various other things in business is to decide what not to do. So is that where you started to realise the importance of both focus and belief?
Yes, I think you quite clearly described them there, Pete. I don't have too much to add to that, apart from saying that these days there are so many potential distractions that we have in the workplace and outside of work. So many potential demands on our time. And so it is that ability to focus and to come up with the vital few. For example, in your sledge, going to the Arctic, you can't take everything that would make life completely comfortable. You're there with the bare minimum, the things that you need to survive. And so you think carefully, because you're dragging that sledge every day. It's heavy. So anything you put in it, you're going to have to use physical effort to move it across the ice. So it really makes you focus on what is actually most important. And I think today sometimes maybe we find it difficult to say no, to get clarity on what really there are the important things in a business that will take big strides, to help a business to take big strides forward. And we get caught up on the inconsequential. So, there's nothing better than going off to the Arctic and really realising about you must focus on what is most important, and you must believe that you can get there as well.
Very true, Sue. And I have to ask, I know one of you colleagues took a book of poetry and you all decided to take one luxury item. What was yours? Sounds like a little bit like Desert Island Disc this, but yes, what was your luxury item?
Well, I think it's relevant for our conversation about how do you get ideas and inspiration from outside? Because sometimes we do get caught up in our own world and it can be challenging and difficult as a manager or a leader. So how and where do we get inspiration from? So I decided that if I was having a really bad day, I'd want to learn about somebody else who had faced challenges and had overcome them. And then I'd be able to say to myself, well, if they can do it, I can do it as well. And so my book was the biography of Sally Gunnell, who was the Olympic 400-metre hurdle gold medalist. And it worked perfectly for me. So, on those days where I was exhausted and I think I can't go on, then I'd read, well, how did Sally make it? And she would talk about her challenges and trying to get into the Olympics and so on. And I'd say to myself, well, if Sally can do it, I can do it too. And that was great inspiration for me. And sometimes you just need to get out of your own world and see something else that's possible.
The other thing I think we all would envy is that you said when you're on an expedition, the one thing it's easy to do is to clear your mind of everything. And that's so tough to do in our busy lives, whether we're leaders, managers or anybody. How do you do it when you're back from an expedition and you're back in the world of speaking and coaching? Do you have an approach to clearing your mind and just relaxing?
Well, it is quite a simple one. I just don't look at my phone as well. I'm determined that a phone, or let's call it, the capacity for technology will not control me. It's down to me to choose and control how I use it and when I use it. So a bit like back to those, those girls at school where I didn't have to be in the in crowd. I'm quite happy to choose, if somebody sends me a WhatsApp text or a message, I will choose when I respond to that. I don't feel the need to respond immediately to it. And therefore that means that I can manage how and when I'm choosing to be distracted by technology and to keep up with all of those things. So it's about being conscious for me, Pete. If we're not, it's our brain and as a human being, our brain's trying to keep us safe, and to keep us safe and to use the minimum amount of energy in our brain, it wants to have systems and procedures, effectively. It wants to repeat things so that it doesn't have to use too much energy thinking about something new and something different. So we get into habits, and habits then mean we can stop thinking about things consciously. So my focus for me is always about how do I create the habits that are helpful and that are meaningful, but make sure I kind of check in on them regularly so that they don't become unhelpful. And what are the things I don't want to have as a habit, so that it means I've actually got to be conscious and I've got to think. And yes, that might be more effortful, but it means then I feel I'm alive. I'm a bit like I'm back in the Arctic. I'm engaging with the world in a different way, rather than just allowing it to just subsume me and not be actually consciously choosing who I'm spending my time with, what I'm thinking about, what I'm looking at. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that tends to be what's important for me.
It does, and it's going beyond just saying don't always be online. And there's a little bit of reason behind it. Yeah, I really like that analogy, or that theory behind how the brain wants to, let's make life easy for our brains, really. So, into the world of work and business, you set a company up to do to pick up where you were training, and tell me a little bit more about that. What prompted that, and what happened to it?
Well, you know how I mentioned that I wanted to have something more than just photographs and an album from that experience of going to the North Pole. So I wanted to use that experience to inspire other people. So I set up in business initially as a motivational speaker. And as I was doing that and doing that successfully, and I still do that today, many people came to me and said, well, we're inspired, but how do we then continue this inspiration? How do we get our people to change? How do we make it sustainable? And so it began to make me realise that I could bring in all of this additional experience that I had of running leadership programmes, of coaching people, that those were really this making inspiration sustainable, was like, how do you continue on with the action? So that the business then expanded into doing these other areas. And, here we are 26 years later, or something like that, 27 years maybe, that I've been running the business. And it's evolved and changed, and other services have come and gone. But at the heart of it is really about how do I engage and inspire people to explore their potential, and organisations. And then the tools that I have to be able to do that are the things like speaking and coaching and podcasting and writing.
And I know originally when you did the speaking, then the senior leaders would often ask you to come in and do some training. And the 3 competencies that you mentioned right at the very beginning were change management, communication, and influencing. 3 skills that are still very important today. How do you think sort of the need for those has evolved since you were first teaching them in the beginning? And what are the really key competencies today? Are they the same?
Yes, they are the same, I think, in terms of managing change. Well, change has only got faster. So I think we have to even more importantly know how to do that, and to do that well. So being comfortable with uncertainty as a leader or a manager, and helping our people to be comfortable with uncertainty, comfortable enough with uncertainty, and to find a way through change. I think influencing and communication, well, the way that we engage with the world is all about influence, isn't it? A child asking its parent for an ice cream is a form of influence. Stamping their feet is another form of influence if they don't get that ice cream. So, we that's how human beings engage with one another. And I think, again, with the way that we use technology to sell, to build relationships, is how do we want to influence? What's the message we're trying to convey? Which brings us on to that third point about communication. I do think and find it slightly sad that it seems that we're so much not valuing the basic form of human face-to-face communication, or even speaking on the telephone. And whilst we have the benefit today, Pete, of using technology to have this conversation, I think if we were to then meet face-to-face, we would bring a completely different experience to our interaction together. And so, yes, it costs time, it costs money, and it's not always the best use of those things. Sometimes there is the value of just meeting up with people face to face to get that emotional connection that sometimes you don't get when you're just looking at a screen. So how we communicate is really critical. I had a coaching client recently who was having trouble with their team to get buy-in and to change. And when we were exploring what to do, I said, well, how about you could pick up the phone and have a conversation with these people. You could reach out and speak to them one-to-one. And the person said, well, that's going to take time. I said, yes, and exactly. That is what building relationships is all about, building trust. It takes time, and it takes focus and commitment to have individual conversations with people, understand where they're coming from. And then, hey presto, of course, that individual went and did that. They had conversations one-on-one with their team, and the change happened because they understood where the other people were coming from. Sending an email doesn't always cut it. So I think, these days, communication and how we do it is even more important.
I couldn't agree more. It never ceases to amaze me when I talk to people and they go, I've had 8 Zoom calls today. I've not had time to think. And you can't function like that. Coming back to your earlier point, the brain, cannot go flat out all day. And I think once you've met somebody, and I've been lucky enough to meet you, so once you've met somebody, then the video conversations are much easier because you've got that. But also on a video call, when you end, you're either on to something else, and you don't get that little 5-10 minutes, what we used to call the water cooler conversation, where you just get a chance to natter. And the amount of times walking to the door of a meeting room, somebody's gone, oh, and I forgot to talk about X, and it was probably the most important thing of the hour you had together. So I couldn't agree more with that. What other things are you finding in coaching of particularly, senior leaders? What are you finding that surprises you, that are things that you would expect them to be good at, that you're helping them become up to standard at, if you like?
Well, I think you've just answered that question yourself, Pete, is time to think. I think I observe that the way that sometimes we imagine thinking is almost like sitting in a darkened room. Now I'm thinking, and nobody sees anything happening. And therefore, if there's no activity, external activity, somehow we're doing nothing. And yet a leader has to do that thinking to take in all the information that's happening in their organization and work out that strategy. And I find that when I sit with a leader, a very senior leader, in an hour in a coaching conversation, sometimes I don't even have to say anything. And they just find that space to think, to express their perspective, to work through an argument on something and realize perhaps it isn't as a great idea as they thought or whatever. But they have got that space to exercise their thinking. And that is, if there's anything that I see that leaders should invest in more, is taking the time, investing the time to find a way to exercise their thinking. And of course, the advantage of working with a coach is it's a non-judgmental atmosphere. I don't have any vested interest in that particular person's situation and what decision they're going to take. If we speak to our partner or our friends or our colleagues or other leaders in an organisation, sometimes everyone's got a vested interest in what decision you might take. So it doesn't always have to be in a coaching relationship that happens, but the principle of taking time to think and blocking that even in your calendar, as you don't even have to call it thinking time. You could just call it a meeting with yourself, or just put meeting, but find a way to. And it can be getting out if you're working in an office environment. Get out of your office, out of your space where you're working, and go for a walk. That we changing perspective, generating energy in a different way. That's what will help our brain to function more effectively. Often people say the best ideas happen in the shower. Well, there's a reason for that, because we've actually switched off from all the other distractions and we allow our brain to just process things. So, I would love to see people taking more time, and leaders to say, I've spent this morning thinking, and being kind of proud to talk about that, rather than just I've spent this morning doing in meetings, because those meetings may not be as productive if they haven't had the thinking time ahead of it.
Absolutely, Sue, and I have a recurring meeting every day with myself. It's something I've done for years. The other thing that I've always done is I have a meeting with the team with no agenda. I ban any other business, because I think if something's important enough, it should go on the agenda. But then we also have meetings where we might talk about business, or we might talk about just things we've done. And as you say, the most amazing ideas can come out of completely different conversations. So it's very interesting to hear you say that. Is that largely driven by this pressure of time, and everybody's really maxed out or perceives to be, and doesn't make that space to actually be creative and step back, as opposed to just being pedal to the metal flat out all the time?
Well, yes, and also in pursuit of what? Busy in pursuit of what? And that we talked about focus earlier on, and I observe that in some organisations and companies, they have a stated vision or mission, and then they come up with a few objectives to work towards that. And then as, of course, things change, they then, rather than 5 objectives, they then end up with about 10 or 12. And I remember listening to, I think it was Professor Rebecca Henderson from Harvard. And one of the phrases that she talked about when we have this sense of overwhelm is that we need to learn to say no to good things. Now, if you think what that actually means is that out of our ever-expanding list of objectives or activities, saying no to something doesn't mean it's not valuable. It just maybe mean it's not valuable today, here and now, because we've got something else to focus on. And it might be no, not today, it might be no, not ever, or it might be no, I'll do it in a little while. But that ability to say no and to recognise that what that actually means, it's saying no to good things, is a skill that is, I see less and less. People, leaders, sometimes they can't see the wood for the trees. And so back to the busyness is busy doing what? And maybe that thinking time that you're talking about, Pete, with your colleagues or with yourself, is maybe just sometimes useful to come back and go, am I doing the vital few things today? Are these meetings, are these activities that I'm involved in, am I needed for them all, or could somebody else do it? And if I am needed, what is my unique contribution that I'm going to bring? Do I need to be in all the meeting? Or is it taking us and the business and the organisation towards what our stated mission and objectives are? And if no, why are we doing it? And so back to the habitual question again, busyness in pursuit of what would be the question I'd always ask people to think about.
It's a danger for curious people who always want to find out about lots of things. But the other thing we often say in the team is if everything's important, nothing is important, because you just cannot do everything you want to do. Definitely. So the North Pole wasn't enough. Tell me about the trip to Antarctica.
Well, Antarctica and many other places since then, Pete, have piqued my curiosity. Antarctica, I was part of a team where we had 35 young people from 25 countries, led by Robert Swan, and we went down to Antarctica, and those young people got to experience it firsthand. Earlier on we were talking about the difference between a virtual conversation and meeting face-to-face, and how they're whole different things. Well, it's a bit like that. We can talk about Antarctica and why it needs to remain pristine and why it needs to remain belonging to no one and only for scientific purposes, which is its current status. But you can't see why that is so important until you viscerally experience it. And so that's what Robert's aim was. He was thinking very long term, because in 2041, the Antarctic Treaty comes up for renewal. And so he wanted to bring young people who potentially would be those influencers of the future down to Antarctica to experience it for themselves, so that as they evolve in their careers and into positions of influence, they will have felt that sense of why it's so important. And, here we are 25 and so years on from there. Several of those young people who now are a little bit older are in positions of influence, and they do talk about how that changed their lives and it changed their perspective on why we need to care for the environment. So it was great for me to be a mentor, and a support to those young people and help to inspire them in, again, the pursuit of a bigger mission for the world and to think about how they can have an impact.
And one of the things that really intrigued me about that is it nearly didn't happen, because the ship I think you were going to use had an incident, had to go for repair, and there was a delay of 2 weeks. And you were sat there with inexperienced people who'd travelled all this way, and you had to, and it's something, a leadership skill I think is really important, that you had to remain positive that something would come out of it. And then the other thing you did, and comes about adapting to change, you sat down with them all and democratically you decided what would be the best use of time. And again, they just seem to me as two really important leadership traits. Do you see that a lot in the really good people that you're coaching?
Well, it's a lovely example of facing uncertainty, isn't it? We can work towards events in not in Antarctica, but we can work towards events in our normal lives, and then there's a train strike, or there's some event that precludes our event from happening, or some limitation or family incident. And how do we then adapt in the moment? And so, for me, the two leadership points are something about is how do we accept and not resist, go with the flow, and see that if the bigger mission is still achieved or still our focus, that there's more than one way to get there. So with those young people in Antarctica, I think the mindset of Robert, who said, we need to have everyone to sit together and work out what to do. His mindset was, I don't have all the answers here. It's unknown for me too. So let's use the power of the group to work out how best we use our time and how we can. We're here in Ushuaia, in the bottom of Tierra del Fuego in South America. So how do we just make use of what we have with us to learn and to learn about one another and so on? So yeah, I think that expect the unexpected. How do you adapt to that sort of situation is a really useful lesson for leaders today as well.
Now, as someone who's actually a very good traveller, I fortunately don't get seasickness or air sickness, but I have to ask, Tell me about Drake's Passage and what's that like? First of all, explain to everybody what that is.
Yes. Well, it's a stretch of water that goes from Tierra del Fuego, if you think about the bottom of the continent of America, between there and Antarctica, which is mostly the route that ships will take to get down to Antarctica. And because there is no land that protects the currents and the winds down the bottom of the world there, then the potential for turbulent water is quite high. So the Drake's Passage can be calm as a lake, and it's wonderful when it's like that, but it also can be really turbulent. So again, we're back to expecting the unexpected. On our journey down there, the first time I went to Antarctica, I think my face was green, as was everybody else's, for about 3 days. We got the worst of the Drake Passage. But you know, when you've been through that discomfort, and then you get the magic of seeing an iceberg floating towards you in the water. You see your first penguin sitting on a block of ice. You know, you can't. That's just an amazing thing to see and experience, and all of a sudden you forget about how ill you feel because nature is there staring you in the face in all its brilliance.
Wonderful. The good stuff certainly makes you forget the bad stuff. Now, there's a couple of other things that I remember you talking about. First is one of the lessons, and it was one of your colleagues, Till, when you were roped together and somebody wanted to go in front. And it was a very good sort of illustration of a management skill that always be willing to learn and coach rather than dictate. Can you tell me a little bit more about that, please?
Yeah, of course, Pete. That was another expedition I did in Greenland. We were skiing across the Greenland ice cap, 4 of us. Now, we were going through a crevassed area, which is a pretty high-risk environment because you can ski across a piece of ice and there's a big chasm underneath that, and the weight of you or your sledge could cause that ice and snow to break and you could plummet to your death. So that's not really the outcome we want. So hence, we were all roped up together, 4 of us. Yourself through your sledge onto the next person. So it's kind of like a giant snake or a sort of 3-legged race where you're all having to move at the same speed. And we had one person who had experience, our German colleague, 3 of us with no experience of going through that type of environment. So, you know, what would you do in a team if you had somebody with experience? You'd probably say, hey, you lead. And that's what we did. So our German colleague, Till, he led at the start. And after a few minutes, when people get a sense of, well, this doesn't look too difficult, one of the other members of the team wanted to go at the front. They wanted to lead. And so Till enabled that to happen. But after about 5 minutes, he was just really telling her what to do from the second position. That wasn't really coaching her and enabling and empowering her to learn. So he realised, and he got back in the front. And once we'd got through that, he realised and he gave her some information and kind of coached her. But then we went on further. We were no longer skiing roped up. We were now free to ski at any speed we wanted. So a bit like, you know, empowering your team, go off and do. But you need to have some boundaries and some agreed ways of working. Well, we didn't really quite have that. So everybody's off skiing across the ice at different speeds. And of course, then there's a gap getting wider and wider and wider. And I, at the start, believed I was as fit as anybody else. I was taking a quarter share of the weight in my sledge. And as we began to ski without our rope up together, everybody else was heading off in front of me. So my so-called expertise, I thought, well, maybe I'm not the strongest here. And I got really frustrated. And I went through the whole thing from, why are they going so fast? We can't go at that speed, to poor me, where I started to cry, but my goggles froze and I couldn't see where I was going, to let's just take one step at a time. So I went through all of the range of emotions. And then inside our tent at the end of the day, nobody said anything about this. And there was all of this frustration. And, you know, I'm sure you've been in meetings like that in your life where there's an elephant in the room, as we describe it, but nobody will talk about it. And, of course, the next day, then one of my teammates, not the German, one of the Norwegians, who was much fitter than anybody else, he got a muscle strain in his leg and he was way out front. And that was like the catalyst for the conversation. So we sat down together and everybody was shouting and not listening to one another. So we had to get those emotions out, but we stuck with it. So there's nowhere to escape to. You have to have the conversation. And in that conversation, the fit Norwegian said, look, with my muscle strain, Sue, give me some of the weight from your sledge. That will free you up to ski faster and it will slow me down and we'll find a speed that will accommodate everybody. But, you know, as I said when you heard me talk about this, Pete, That was one of the most important lessons I learned on the expedition. Because first of all, I had to accept to myself that I did have a weakness, that I wasn't as fit as the others in that context. But if in accepting that and giving away some of the weight from my sledge, I was helping the entire team to potentially succeed. So I took myself out of my own personal situation and perhaps resistance to change to saying what's actually here for the greater good. And if we focus on the greater good, then I'm more accepting of making a change. And I also recognised, yes, that was a weakness, but I also had strengths in many other areas that I brought to the team. So it was also about keeping that perspective and balance for me. And I see that often in teams, people are resistant to making change because they're only focusing on their own situation. And we have, as a leader, to be able to take people to that perspective about the greater good, the greater mission, and how as a group can people then adapt in pursuit of that bigger mission. And it's okay to not be good at everything, but know what your strengths are and maximise those.
That's fascinating. And I think this ability to talk and bring things out in the open, and I've seen it with various cultures, it does vary a lot, but it always holds things back and wastes a lot of time. In fact, there's a couple of other stories which I have to ask about, which again took something to get them to come to the fore. The first one I think is about the food and who was getting the most, and I have to ask about the flatulence one as well, obviously.
Yes, those important leadership lessons. Well, about the food, when you're in the Arctic and you're skiing, you have a sort of bag of snacks for the day to give you energy. Peanuts, chocolate bars, pepperami sticks. You can imagine the type of foodstuffs that give you high calorific value. And within our team, I observed how people sort of manage their food, a bit like their allocation of food for the day. And for some people, they looked at it very logically and they said, okay, there's going to be likely to be 8 hours of breaks today. We'll have a break every hour. So they just equally divided up their food into 8 portions. So that was very logical. And then there were people who just liked all the good things. So they tended to eat them first. And that was me. So sometimes by the end of the day, I had nothing left because I'd eaten all the good things very early on in the day. And I'd be looking at other people and seeing if they had anything left that they didn't want to eat. And then the last type were the entrepreneurs. And they were really, using that skill of observation and noticing everybody else. And they began to hoard their food. So they would always have in their sledge extras of all the different types of foodstuffs. And when you had people like me coming to say, oh, I just love a pepperami stick or a chocolate biscuit, one would always appear from their sledge. And then they would say, well, what's it worth today? And, there was this sort of currency in trading. And I think one day I gave away 5 of my pepperami sticks just to get back 1 chocolate bar in return. So there was this wonderful way of things like that keep people motivated. And of course, we're human beings. We all have different ways of looking at the world. And that was a wonderful illustration of that. And of course, the effect of food when you're in a tent is that it can cause flatulence. Now, this does seem a ridiculous thing to say and talk about on a podcast, but nevertheless. So we set up a procedure. Now, again, this could be relevant for business in terms of, you have a problem, you have an issue, people emitting smells, let's say, noxious smells inside the tent. So we need to have a procedure to manage that. So we agreed that, no, actually, we didn't agree. One person in our tent decided and suggested that the way to do that would be only allowed to emit a smell, let's say, when you're inside your sleeping bag. So then it contains the problem. Well, of course, the procedure sounds fine in theory. But what happened the next day was one individual, when they felt they were going to emit a smell, they climbed into their sleeping bag, did what they wanted to do, and then 1 minute later, then they just climbed back out the sleeping bag. So, of course, that was just rendered completely useless as a way of containing the odour. And everybody else just fell about laughing. So for me, it's kind of a lovely example of, procedures or changing behaviour or agreeing ways of working. They have to be relevant and they have to be something that's workable and practical, rather than just kind of following the letter of the law, but not the spirit of the law.
Indeed. I think it's called failing fast these days, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely.
Brilliant. Now we've come to the point where I'd like to ask you for some recommendations. So books, podcasts, your book and podcast goes without saying. Websites or people that you go for inspiration, obviously beyond Sally Gunnell. What sort of things do you have for us?
Well, I've got three. I'm going to put them up on the screen here so people can see them. I'm sure you'll put links in the notes here as well. One is this book, Range, David Epstein. And the reason I say this book, because sometimes people follow a career path, or they find themselves on some sort of career path in an organisation. And that career, the path that has taken them is they've tried many different things and they see themselves as a generalist as opposed to a specialist. And then they think, well, what value do I bring to an organisation? I'm not really skilled in anything. I just have this range of experiences. Well, this book really reminds people that actually that is what's needed in today's world, because moving around and getting lots of different experiences it shows adaptability. It gives us a sense of something. So sometimes becoming too specialist can be limiting. So having that adaptability and these skills are important in today's world. So that's one that I'm always recommending to coaching clients. The second one is this one, Radical Humility. And I think, here is this juxtaposition between, as Urs Kunig, the author, says, being a badass leader and a good human. So this is about, delivering results and holding people accountable is the leadership area. And then, but doing it in a way where actually how you show humility and build relationships with people. So I like this because it's very clear and practical and brings those two sides that are really important in business. And then this third one is on a similar vein. This is Hubert Joly, The Heart of Business. Now, he was the leader of a big corporate in the US. And what he realised was, again, to bring out the heart of people in a business is helping them to really understand what the bigger purpose is and see them as human beings. So those three things, those books I really recommend, because I think it is this combination of high performance and excellence and bringing out seeing people as people. And if we can do that as a leader to enable those two things to be delivered concurrently, then I think that's what helps people to really get to the bigger mission of a business or an organisation. So the sort of podcasts and articles that I also read, I like following the Thinkers 50. I don't know if you've come across that. The Thinkers 50 is an award every year where the latest management thinkers, there's a kind of ranking, and then they have another ranking for the sort of up and coming management thinkers. So that helps to keep you ahead of what are the trends in terms of management and leadership. And then there's some podcasts, and to this point about range, I listen to a range of podcasts in different sort of genres. One's a high performance podcast, and another one is supporting champions. There's always a good nugget there. They can be sometimes more sports focused, but there's nothing more important than taking lessons from sport and bringing them into business. And then, other things about human beings, again, back to the humanity aspect, is things like Desert Island Discs or This Cultural Life, where people are speaking about their experiences and effectively what's made them a human being. And I think the more we can learn and understand how human beings tick, the better we can be as a leader or a manager. So those are some of my recommendations. Of course, my own Access to Inspiration podcast, which you might also mention, Pete, is something that has given me a great education and pleasure in hosting that and operating that.
Absolutely. Thank you, Sue. Now, I'd just like to finish with something that you said on Teams, which is that you make the best of it, you be tolerant and just accept it's not going to be endurable all the time. I think you said it relating to on your expedition. It just resonated with me as being just brilliant advice for anybody, really, certainly in business. Looking back with all the stuff you've learnt and been curious about over the years, what's the bit of advice that you would give to your younger self?
Oh, there's a good question. I think it is to perhaps be bolder and to follow that curiosity. Sometimes, to follow the curiosity and to trust that it will lead to something that you never expected, and that is a good thing. So I've done that to a degree. Maybe in some other situations, is not always believing that being curious will lead to something. So I think it's kind of trusting your gut, perhaps trusting yourself, and just going for it. That would be a bit of advice I'd probably give to myself.
That's wonderful. Sue, thank you so much for being on the Managing People podcast. It's really been my pleasure.
Thank you, Pete. Lovely to speak to you, and thank you for those great questions.
So, did you pick up some tips you can put to work straight away? I do hope so. There's new ideas in every episode, so hit subscribe now and stay ahead. And if you know someone who could use some fresh ideas on management, share this episode with them. Who knows, it might just make a real difference for them and their team. You'll find everything we talked about today, plus loads more resources, over at the People Managing Hub. The link's in the show notes. See you next time.